important group of classes is the container classes. I mean, it's going to be one class basically, but yeah, this is another important class that we used a lot in our projects, and you will be using a lot in your future Tailwind CSS projects. So we have one class which is container, and we can use it for basically we can have SM, MD, LG, and XL for the breakpoints. So a container, it basically it basically contains items and content. So you basically put in your items in a container, and the thing is with it, it will automatically adjust the maximum width, so that as your screen gets bigger, so different devices will have different widths, and it will basically check the width, and it will have a max width for that current device. So let's just show you an example so it becomes more clear. So as you can see right now, we have our device width is 446. If we were to increase that, it will basically increase with it, and until it gets to 640. So let's go back to the documentation just to explain. So we have SM devices. SM devices. So the container would have, if we have a screen more than 640 pixels, it will basically have a max width of 640 pixels. So now we're at 640. As you can see, the max width is, wait, let's go smaller. So now the max width is still at 640, even though our device is 744 pixels. Why? Because let's go back to the documentation. As you can see, the next one is MD. MD requires the screen to be above 768 pixels. When it's above this, then it will set the max width to the 768 pixels. So when it basically reaches that, then see, as soon as we reach 768, the maximum width increases. So we have these breakpoints. So a container will automatically adjust the max width so that the content doesn't go overboard and it doesn't overflow. So unless you do use a specific class that allows you to overflow your content, and then it wouldn't, like if you use flex wrap none, then it would allow the content to remain on the screen. But otherwise, it would basically allow you to keep the content within the screen, and the user wouldn't have to scroll. So another thing is the first breakpoint. Let's go to the documentation. The first breakpoint has a maximum width of 100, and that would be applied when your screen device is below 640 pixels. So that summarizes the container and how it basically it contains the items and how it keeps it responsive. Now we're going to cover the position group of classes. These are very important when positioning your elements when you're styling them. So we're mainly going to cover the absolute and relative positioning, because these are the ones that we mainly use throughout the projects, and you will be using them as well in the future projects. So let's cover the absolute position first of all. Or actually, let's cover the relative, because that's what we mainly use. So relative position positions an element according to the normal flow of the document. So if you have an element before it and then you add the next element after it in the code, then it will be actually positioned right after it. So right after the other one ends, this one will be positioned. So as you can see over here, we have relative parent and we have absolute child. So when we have for example the paragraph relative parent, the div after it will be basically inserted right after the relative parent. The absolute positioning. So with absolute positioning, it allows you to position an element outside of the normal flow of the document, causing the neighboring elements to act as if the element doesn't exist. So the one before it wouldn't really affect the current element. So let's say we have in the code we have a div, and then the next div after it is absolutely positioned. Now the first element before it, that is relatively positioned, or whatever positioning it uses, it would not affect the one after it. So it wouldn't be inserted right after it like it would be with the relative. So in this case, as you can see over here, we have an absolute child. So as you can see, when we're using static positioning in the first one, and in the second one we're using absolute positioning. As you can see, the absolute child is the static child is basically fixed right over there, static basically, and the absolute child has its own style. It doesn't care about all the other styles. It would even be on top of them if it wants to, depending on how you have positioned it and how you have basically aligned it as well. So yeah, that's mainly the difference between absolute and relative, which is what we basically mainly use.